Have you ever wondered what happens when a classic story from one culture travels halfway across the world to another? Today, we're diving deep into that very question by looking at how Herman Melville's masterpiece, Moby-Dick, was completely reimagined for children in the Arab world through animated cartoons. It's a fascinating journey of transformation.
Now, this entire explainer is grounded in a specific, rigorous piece of academic work. We're looking at the paper Melville in Motion, Cultural Transformations of Moby-Dick in Arabic-dubbed cartoons, authored by Muhammad Abu Adel and his colleagues. It was published in the World Journal of English Language, Volume 15, Number 4 in 2025. We'll be walking through their analysis and findings.
So, how are we going to break this all down? Well, first, we'll introduce the study itself and why it's so important. Then we'll get into the critical theory they use to analyze the cartoons. After that, we'll explore the really interesting political and cultural changes made to the story. We'll even look at the poetry of the song lyrics. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with the key findings and recommendations from the paper.
All right, let's start at the beginning. What was the point of this study, and what makes it such a significant contribution? You know, Moby-Dick has been picked apart from just about every angle you can imagine, but the authors of this paper noticed that a huge piece of the puzzle was missing. There was virtually no critical research on how Arab and Muslim audiences read and interpret Melville's work. This study steps right into that gap, using cartoons as a window into that unique cultural reception.
Okay, so to really dig into their analysis, we need to get our heads around the main tool they're using to understand these cartoons. It's a powerful idea from literary theory.
And that tool is called reception theory. Now, the core idea here is actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly profound. It says that the meaning of a story isn't just locked away in the text. Instead, meaning is something that gets co-created every time someone reads or watches it. The audience brings their own culture, their own history, their own expectations, and that actively shapes the story's meaning. The theorist Wolfgang Iser had a great way of putting it. He said that texts have gaps and blind spots. Think of it this way. A story isn't a solid, complete object. It's more like a blueprint. And it's our job, as the audience, to fill in those gaps using our own imagination and background. That's where the magic of interpretation really happens.
So let's just boil this down. First, the viewer isn't just a passive sponge soaking up a story. They're an active producer of its meaning. Second, a story's meaning isn't timeless. What Moby-Dick meant to someone in 1851 is totally different from what it means to a kid watching a cartoon today. And finally, every audience approaches a story with a unique set of expectations that shapes everything they see. All right, with that theory in our back pocket, let's get to the really juicy stuff, the specific, concrete changes the cartoon made to the original story. This is where we see reception theory in action. The paper kicks off this section with a really powerful question. How would a child growing up in the modern Arab world view Captain Ahab's obsessive, all-consuming hunt for that one white whale? The answer, it turns out, is very different from the original intention.
The authors argue that, viewed through the lens of recent history, Ahab's quest can be read as a political allegory. His single-minded hunt for a monster might look a lot like a metaphor for powerful nations invading other countries, claiming a moral high ground while really seeking to control precious resources like oil.
And this new interpretation leads to a massive change, a complete reversal of hero and villain. In Melville's novel, Moby-Dick is this terrifying symbol of evil. But in the cartoon, he's a gentle, friendly, lovable creature. The true aggressor, the real monster of the story, becomes Captain Ahab himself. It's a fundamental flip.
Now, beyond that big political shift, there was also a lot of careful editing to make the story fit its new cultural context. Quico's famous tattoos? Gone. Any mention of Christianity, churches, the Bible, the story of Jonah? All removed. His non-Islamic religious practices? Also gone. But just as importantly, scenes of racism and bullying were cut out, shifting the story's message to actively promote positive values like tolerance and acceptance.
But it's not just about what they took out. The paper shows how the creators went a step further into a deeper process they called Arabization. And you can see this most clearly in the songs that were written for the cartoon.
So what's the difference here? Well, simple translation is just swapping words from one language to another. Arabization, as the paper defines it, is a much more profound adaptation. It's about reshaping the entire work to fit seamlessly into the new culture's social norms and even its poetic traditions. And this slide is the perfect example. In an English song, you might have lyrics that celebrate individualism, like being far from home myself or staying up late by myself.
But in the Arabic version of the cartoon song, those lines are just gone. They were removed because they clash with the more collectivist, family-focused values prevalent in Arab culture.
And this wasn't just about changing the meaning. It was incredibly artistic. For instance, Captain Ahab's song was completely rewritten from scratch to follow the strict, complex meter of a classical Arabic poetic form. This shows an amazing dedication to making the work feel truly at home in its new environment, not just like a foreign import.
Okay, so we've seen the political shifts, the cultural edits, and the poetic adaptations. So what's the big takeaway here? Let's dive into the paper's main conclusions.
The bottom line is this. The Arabic-dubbed cartoons are not just a simplified Moby-Dick. No way. They are a fundamentally new piece of art with its own new meanings. The story is purposefully transformed into an educational tool that champions tolerance and cooperation. The characters and themes are carefully tailored to be culturally and religiously fitting, and the deep process of Arabization truly embeds the story in local artistic and social traditions.
Based on all this, the authors make a few key recommendations for where this kind of research should go next. They urge more scholars to analyze these kinds of deep cultural adaptations of other classics. They call for a richer conversation about using reception theory to understand translated works. And, very importantly, they encourage everyone involved in creating children's content to make sure positive educational values are always a priority.
And one last thing, and this is especially for all you researchers and academics listening. The complete paper we've been discussing, along with a pre-formatted APA citation, is available for you to download in the description below. This is a Scopus indexed publication, so citing it can add real, significant value to your own related academic work.
So we'll leave you with the big question that this whole study really circles around. When a story crosses a cultural border, does it just get a new coat of paint, or is an entirely new story born from the process? As this paper powerfully argues, in the case of Moby-Dick's journey into Arabic cartoons, the answer is clearly the latter. A new story was born.